On becoming. Once you were not a people, but now you are a people of God. Good morning. As you heard, I am Tim Reaburn, and I am the pink sheep of my family and a pink sheep of the church. It is so nice to be here to share, at least virtually, with you in these congregations who have started the journey towards becoming affirming. Historically, you were a part of Waterloo Presbytery, and that is where I too began my journey in the church that led to ordered ministry and the passion I have for justice. This is a Sunday on which all sorts of justice lines come together and align. And I would be remiss if I did not remark that yesterday was the 54th anniversary of Loving versus Virginia in the United States that struck down the inability for people of different races to marry. I will mark another justice moment shortly, but that is always part of who we are as the church. 5 years ago this morning, I was on my way to church and I had to throw away my sermon and start over. So the other justice moment that I remember is that yesterday was the 5th anniversary of the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, Florida. I did not know anyone personally that was killed or wounded that night, but it really was only 1 degree of separation. Had I made just a few phone calls or texts, I would have found in my circle of friends someone who was affected. 5 years ago seems like such a long time. So much has changed in that time. Things like churches like yours working on becoming affirming. And so much has remained unchanged. So it is good to be here with you this morning. I'm often asked, why does the church need to walk this journey towards becoming affirming? The church is at its core a human institution. And I'm mindful of the words in our call to worship, or in our opening prayer. The church has not always lived up to its vision. There was no Christian church for Jesus. He was raised and rooted in his own Jewish traditions. But in the absence of Jesus, following the ascension, which was just a few weeks ago in our liturgical calendar, and rooted in the Pentecost experience, the church was instituted to ensure the transmission of the stories and teachings of Jesus. Over time, the church has struggled in the same way that all human institutions struggle, with corporate and institutional sin. The church ultimately reflects the social and cultural norms that surround it, rather than being a call to inclusion and love. What that means in history is the church has too often been an instrument of oppression and suppression rather than a nexus of joy and hope. The affirming process is part of the reconstruction of the church to better fit the call we have to be a whole people of God. Who are we? Not individually, but as a whole. In Genesis, we hear that we bear the image and likeness of God. In the reading today, we hear that we are a people of God, that we are part of a royal priesthood. The German-American theologian Michael Velker argues that we bear the image and likeness of God in individual, infinite diversity that is the totality of human experience. What this means is that if we start excluding individuals for who they are, for who God intends them to be, then we reduce our reflection of God's likeness in us. There has always been a tension in our society about gender and sexuality. We have a tendency to want to put things in little boxes so that we can control them and render them neutral. But God broke the boxes of the world with the Easter resurrection event. when we try and live in this comfortable world that never threatens us, we do a disservice to the inbreaking of God into history in the resurrection experience. I hear many United Church communities and many more non-United Church communities make comments along the lines of, but why do we have to take time talking about this? Can't we just be welcoming and keep the other stuff out of the church or our service or our community? The long and short answer to this is no. Let me tell you some stories. I remember having to stand up in Waterloo Presbytery and defend my right to exist in the church. And when I did this, I was not ordained. I was a lay rep from my church in Cambridge. So I had to defend myself against those who were in ordered ministry, speaking with a different level of power in the church than I had. I remember having to call out someone from Brantford at my table group at Hamilton Conference. We had just talked about creating safe space, and then she spoke of those people and their agenda. I remember being challenged by a member of the Education and Students Committee of Waterloo Presbytery on whether my smile was hiding something. I found out a couple of years later it was he who was hiding his sexuality and projected his hiding on me rather than dealing with his own identity. I remember the chair of the Education and Students Committee literally running to a dark corner of a bar in hopes that I hadn't seen her there. This is very recent history in our church. And it matters beyond our church as well. I was married almost 5 years ago through the church that I served in at that time in Paisley, Ontario. We were married by Gord Dunbar, perhaps you know him, then the president of Hamilton Conference. My church community commissioned a stunning quilt as a wedding gift, and it was made by our local quilting guild. But this was public enough. The quilting guild met in the basement of the Presbyterian Church. That shortly thereafter, the local ministerial association disbanded rather than including the now visibly gay minister in town. We continue to work on becoming affirming, to create safe spaces in communities that are often still not safe and welcoming. This is God's work. And it is not just Canada for whom we do this. 4 years ago, I was part of a mission and service global pilgrimage to Kenya. While there, a few of us for whom this issue is a passion had the opportunity to connect with Pembizo. This is a Pan-African ministry that works to bring inclusion for rainbow spectrum folks. 4 of us visited 2 safe houses on the outskirts of Nairobi and met with refugees mostly from the north of Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, and South Sudan. Kenya is not particularly progressive by North American standards, but at least in Kenya, these mostly young men would not likely face the possibility of death. Pembizo is a mission and service supported ministry. In fact, the United Church of Canada was the first international church to support this work with a $10,000 grant that got Pembizo an office. Those refugees thanked us, those 4 who visited, for providing a model on how things can get better. We continue to work on becoming affirming to create safe spaces in communities around the world. I will tell you that all of us on that visit left with tears in our eyes because it was they who were the models for courage in the face of tremendous challenges, and yet they thanked us. I referenced my marriage earlier. It was instructive when I got married, not for the big things, but for the small things. We were the first couple to seek a marriage license at South Bruce Peninsula Town Office, where one of the two people was an immigrant. My husband is from Brazil. Gord Dunbar, in marrying us, had to stroke out bride in the marriage register because it was bought at a time when same-gender couples marrying simply couldn't happen. Small things like a marriage register convey care about folks who are part of your community. Language and liturgy, meetings and conversations can do the same thing. To pay attention to pronouns, to be careful of the binary language of male and female, to intentionally build communities that include rather than exclude. These are the work of becoming affirming. Sometimes I hear that these are city issues. They're not things that happen in small towns or the country. To this, I say no. These are not issues of geography, but issues of humanity. And humanity is found everywhere. I recall preparing for a funeral in rural Bruce County, and the day before the service, the deceased sister-in-law called me with the opening line, "Tim, there's something I need to tell you." As a minister, you always dread those words. It was going to be one of those calls. She said to me, "Hugh had a favorite nephew, and he is now a United Church minister. It would be great if there was an opportunity to include him in the service." "Of course, that will not be a problem," I responded. "Oh, and he is now a she." The family simply didn't know what to do with this person who had undergone gender reassessment surgery. They didn't refer to her by her given pronouns or even share the information with the funeral home. How much easier and richer would this service have been if honesty and inclusion was the watchword? At one point, the funeral director came up to the two of us to ask if we knew where Terry was. Terry was supposed to invite the group back to the house for refreshments. Ruth turned to me and simply said, "If they're looking for Terry, you better do it." Gender and sexuality are human characteristics and are not defined by race or geography. I chose the scripture reading this morning from a book of liturgy called Equal Rights, R-I-T-E-S. I love this idea that we cannot have our divine relationship taken away from us by anyone, the church, culture, religion, or each other. Especially when we are part of a church that practices infant baptism. As our entry into the church, we are claimed from the beginning, and we are always included. I was baptized, and no one is going to tell me I am not included. Once we were not a people by culture or theology or psychology or anthropology, but now we are a people of God. Jesus chose to stand with those who were outside society. Women, prostitutes, tax collectors, outsiders, immigrants, the poor. Our call to be the church is a call to stand with those with whom Jesus stood. We were never promised a comfortable pew, but we were promised membership that is abundant with love. Affirm is one lens with which to begin the journey to wholeness. It is certainly not the only one, but it is one with which most congregations can interact. If there are not visible rainbow spectrum folks in your congregation, then there are the families of rainbow spectrum folks. To focus on one lens brings strength and power to your journey. It is easy to lose focus if every oppression is raised up at the same time. Institutional and corporate sin tries to take advantage of this, and it encourages us to get sidetracked by working on too many things at once, so there is no power in what we do. But let me tell you, once anyone has started with the affirm process, or started tackling sexism or racism or misogyny, scales will fall from the eyes, and we will continue to see the multiple journeys that lie ahead of us. Affirm begins the process, and it begins a process that really never ends, because we will always deal with corporate and institutional sin in our societies. It is such a privilege to be here to help celebrate Rockwood's anniversary. This is certainly not the way we would have thought to be celebrating. We spent the last 16 or so months uncertain of what normal might look like moving forward. And I'm here to proclaim, whether you like it or not, there is no longer any normal. There is normative, the way that many, if not most people, do something, but there is no normal. And that is a good thing. It allows each of us to shine with holy gifts that have been placed in us since the beginning. As you continue your affirming process, what you are doing is showing to your community, your church, your country, the world, that difference matters and that you value each unique, unrepeatable outpouring of the Spirit that is each one of us. I want to honor you for the choice you have made. I want to bless you for this journey you have started. And I want to caution you that the journey will never be over. This is not about a destination, but about the journey. It is about linking arms with like-minded Christians and all others who know that we are a people that matter, that we are a royal and holy priesthood. It is about inviting those we meet on the way to join us and share and learn from these souls that we meet. Thank you. Thank you for living the gospel. Thank you for being willing to look past the mistakes of your history, our history, and turn the living story that is God with us. This is our gospel. This is our good news. And I am so thankful to have folk like you willing to take this journey so that I know I am not alone. This is personal to me. This is personal to each one of us who walks this journey. And to know that we have allies and friends makes the journey so much easier. Thank you, thank you, thank you. May it be so. Amen. Let's do the hymn. So just some context. This is a hymn that I wrote in response to an invitation from the Hymn Society of the United States and Canada as an open call for hymns that reflect gender and sexuality in the church. And I'm privileged to have had this hymn published in their online hymn book called The Holy Other. So thank you. I listed two questions. The first is, how are you becoming? And this is very broad. I've not narrowed it down specifically. How are you becoming in the church? How have you changed? How have you been surprised? What has taken your breath away in this process? And then taking the words of the epistle that we read this morning, what stumbling blocks do you see for your or your church's becoming? Because as I've said, we're living in corporate and institutional sin. The stumbling blocks are all around us, and everyone experiences different things along the way. So what have you found that has been a stumbling block for you, or where have you had to work harder than you expected to do what you were doing? Thank you for the opportunity to be with you this morning. This has been so much fun.